family. I was born in a nominally Christian family. Like a lot of people in the southeastern United States, my family was a family that went to church occasionally, went during Christmas and Easter and other times of that sort. If you'd ask my family, just like if you would ask almost anybody where I was born what religion they were, then to a person they would say they were Christians. Largely that's because it's the southern United States, which has the nickname of, its nickname in the southern United States is the Bible Belt. So it's this big sort of part of the country where everybody is, at least in name, a kind of Christian. It's a kind of social, cultural Christianity. And I was certainly brought up in that, which means that I didn't have a thorough understanding of the gospel. I didn't understand who Christ was and what Christ had come into the world to do, even though I was assuming myself to be a Christian. I didn't know much about the church or the place of the church, even though occasionally I would attend the church. So I was growing up with this very shallow understanding of what it means to be a Christian. And when I was about 15 years old, I had about 2 more years left of high school before graduating. I was a pretty good student, an A-B student. I was a very good basketball player, but that was about 50 pounds ago. Very good basketball player. And I had all of my teammates and we had all of the sort of worldly popularity that comes from being, a pretty good sports team in a small town in the United States, right? And what I did with that was I used it to satisfy my sin nature. Right? So all the advantages that I got from that particular status, I used to satisfy my sin nature. Well, after my sophomore year in high school, 2 years left in high school, along with a number of other guys, I got arrested. It's the first time I've been in trouble. I'm the youngest of 8 kids. I have older brothers. I have 4 older brothers. And the only thing that I really kind of understood about the church was that when my older brothers got in trouble with the law, which happened fairly regularly, they had this routine. They'd get in trouble. They would swear they weren't going to get in trouble anymore. And as proof, they'd go to church for a while. So church was a little bit like rehab. It's kind of where you went when the trouble was really bad. And I had never been in trouble before. And so I'm thinking to myself, I'm in trouble. I don't like this. I've broken my mother's heart. I'd better go to church. And so I went to church for several months, and it was not a church where the gospel was clearly preached. There were lovely people in this church, dear family friends in this church, people who did a lot of good in the community. The pastor was, in so many ways, a wonderful man, but it was not a clear gospel preaching church. And so he did what a lot of churches did in our community. He, at the end of the service, did an altar call where he invited people to come up front and to become members of the church and to be baptized. And I had no idea what was going on, but I figured I've been going to church for 2 months, and this is about the time where my brothers would now go back to what they were doing and be in trouble again, and I don't want to do that, so I'm going to do this next thing that's happening. I'm going to go up front. So I go up front, and a few minutes later, after one of the deacons takes me in this back room and talks to me and gets my address information, he comes back out front and he announces to the congregation that I was a candidate for baptism. And I just thought, wait, hey, you didn't say anything about that. And so 2 weeks later, I'm dunked in the water, but it's sort of like joining the gang. You got to get jumped into the gang, So I get dunked in the water and I'm brought out. I dry off and I leave the church and I go right to the pool hall where I spent all my time. I was not converted, was not saved, didn't understand the gospel. Now, this experience early on had a significant impact on me. It left me believing that Christianity was false, that it was pie in the sky, that it was make-believe, that it was great for little blue-haired ladies, but it had no power in it. That was kind of my thinking when I go off to university. I should say one other thing, just biographically. My father left when I was about 14. He left the family when I was about 14 years old. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was really angry about that. And I had a teacher in high school who tried to help me with my anger. She was this little eccentric lady from New York. How many of you have seen the movie Nanny McPhee? Does that ring any bell for anybody? So a couple of hands. She looked like Nanny McPhee at the beginning of the movie. Just sort of wild hair and just this wonderful little lady. And she gave me, she saw my anger and she was trying to help me with my anger. And she gave me a collection of writings from leaders from the United States in the 1960s. These were radical leftist leaders. And so basically reading those guys, I got more angry. And so I went off to university, this angry young man, 18 years old. My face was just always in a scowl. I didn't even know that I was scowling. It's just how my face had fixed itself. My wife and I could be walking across campus and we could be walking through the middle of a crowd and the crowd would just kind of part around us because it's like, who's this angry kid, That's how I was. I was angry that my dad had left. I thought Christianity was false. And my first year at university, I see these men on campus. They're very clean cut, very upright. They're coming from the community to the campus at various student events. And whenever there was a lecturer on campus or something of that sort, they were sure to participate. And they were often talking about the importance of men, of being self-controlled, righteous, living clean lives free of alcohol and drugs, and being faithful to their wives and raising their families. And as a little boy whose dad had left when he was 14, I had never seen men like this. And it was just, I was like a bee to honey. I was just drawn to them. Long story short, these men were all Muslim men. All right? And so my freshman year began to study with these men and to think about Islam and the claims of Islam. My second year in university is when I converted to Islam. I would have been a Sunni Muslim. And began to practice Islam and became very zealous for Islam. And throughout my years in university, would lead a number of other men into the faith, into the religion of Islam. I became a real zealous defender of Islam and an opponent of the cross. So when Christian students would have their events on campus and begin to talk about Jesus and the crucifixion and Christianity, I'd be that guy in the crowd arguing against that as false and not true. And I would be doing that in part on the strength of my previous experience. And so became a real champion for Islam. Lived that way for several years until my wife and I, several things happened in our lives. One was literally a water cooler conversation. Now, not all water cooler conversations in the workplace are bad, and this was a very good one in my life. We're standing literally at a water cooler. There are about 5 of us, and one of my coworkers who I had gone to university with, she knew me from university, we were all talking about world leaders whom we respected. So one person would say, I respect Mahatma Gandhi, and would talk about Gandhi and different things. Another person said, I respect Martin Luther King Jr., and talked about Martin Luther King Jr. and all those good things. Well, Tracy, my friend from university, after about 3 or 4 people like that had been named, Tracy says, well, there's nobody I respect more than Thabiti. And I said, stop it, She said, no, I'm serious. And I said, stop it. Tell me more. And she says, and she talks about why. She says, you don't drink alcohol, you don't mistreat Christy, and she named all these things. And she says, you're the most righteous person I know. Now, what she didn't know was inside, I was aware of my anger and hatred. I was aware of my lust. I was aware of a whole lot of things that proved I was not righteous. And that if I wasn't righteous in my own conscience, in my own sight, all of a sudden, it was like I was struck by lightning. I was standing there and I realized that if I wasn't righteous in my own sight, how in the world was I going to be righteous before God who knew these things about me? That was the first thing. This awakening to the idea that I needed a righteousness that would please God. And as a faithful Muslim, I didn't have it. Here's the second thing. My wife and I were expecting our first child. We were pregnant with our first child. And we're both from big families. I'm the youngest child of 8 kids. She's number 7. She's the youngest girl of 8 kids. And so it was like the babies of the families were about to start having babies. And so our families would come down to our apartment, and it'd be like a whole caravan of people just, driving up and they'd be bringing bucket loads of food and drinks. And it was just a party. Every weekend we were just having this wonderful time. This great celebration was going on. And 3 months into the pregnancy, when we would hear the baby's heartbeat for the first time, I'm in the doctor's room. We're waiting on the doctor, and I'm out in the lobby. I can't sit still. I'm pacing in the lobby. I'm just so excited, and she's excited. And we go back into the room, and doctor puts her on the table and puts that jelly stuff on her tummy and begins to look for the baby's heartbeat. We're all excited, and a minute goes by, and 3 minutes go by, and 5 minutes go by, and the doctor says, in the coldest human voice I have ever heard in my life, there's no heartbeat. And standing there in that room, all of our idolatry, because we were beginning to worship the idea of starting a family and pursuing the American dream, the White House and the picket fence and the 2.5 kids, all of that just came crashing down. And we felt for the first time a sense of our smallness in the universe, that the things that we held most dear and the things that we were living for, we couldn't protect, we couldn't keep. And so that put me in a bit of a depression. I should have been at work, and I was at home in my pajamas watching television. I was just talking to a young man a moment ago. I turned to BET to watch some rap videos, and sitting there, and this little preacher comes on television. Guy probably about that tall, balding, very plain-looking man, little suit, walks up to the pulpit, and he opens the Bible, and he's in 2 Timothy chapter 3, and he begins to explain 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse by verse. I'd never seen preaching like that. And even though in my heart I had really been an opponent of the gospel, I couldn't explain the attraction I now had to listening to this preacher. I'm sitting there listening to this preacher, and it's like someone has rewritten the Bible. It's like, oh, now the Bible was making sense. It had truth, it had power, it had beauty to it. And so I started watching the show, and my wife would come home. I'd tape the show. I said, man, you got to watch this show I watched today. She said, what is that? I said, well, it's this preacher on television. And she would look at me like I had 3 heads, because she remembered how I used to treat preaching and how I used to treat preachers. And we began to watch his show. And long story short, about 6 months later, we found out his church is in the Washington, D.C. area. Her sister lives there, so we visit her sister one weekend so that we can go to this church. And we're in a church service of about 8,000 people. We're sitting about 10 rows from the pulpit, right in front of the pulpit, and he is preaching Exodus 32, which is the famous passage where the children of Israel make the golden calf, right? And he's preaching that passage, and he's preaching about idolatry and about sin, and it's like I'm the only person in that church of 8,000 people. It's like he's talking directly to me. And then he began to preach Christ from that passage. Crucified for our idolatry, the one true God, the Son of God. Raised for our justification. And as he began to preach Christ, some things that never made sense to me as a Muslim all of a sudden fell into place. I never understood how God was going to be completely holy, as I believed as a Muslim, and yet also often merciful, as I believe. How is he going to be holy and punish me for my unrighteousness, and at the same time forgive those unrighteousness, that unrighteousness? How is he going to be gracious and just? Those are things that I couldn't hold together. And I couldn't hold together the idea that Jesus was born of a virgin, which is plainly taught in the Quran, and yet was not the Son of God, which every Muslim denies. How is Christ born of a virgin, and why is that important? And why does the Hadith say that Satan touches everyone in the womb except Christ? Why must he be pure? Well, I didn't have an answer for that as a Muslim, but here in the preaching of the gospel, I was being told that he was the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, that he had to be perfect and without blemish so that he could provide our righteousness, and that he was taking our place in both judgment and righteousness. And so lots of things that had been questions for me were now sort of clicking. They were falling into place as this man preached the gospel. And in God's great kindness to us, that Sunday morning, under the preaching of the gospel from Exodus 32, my wife and I both were converted to faith in Christ. And the Lord was kind, so kind, to give us new life together as husband and wife. Well, fast forward a number of years, and the Lord would begin in 2006, give me the privilege of going to the United Arab Emirates and participating in a series now. I think we've done 5 public Christian-Muslim dialogues. To my knowledge, this just does not happen very often in that part of the world. Certainly doesn't happen publicly. And with the kind of freedom that the Lord has granted us through the authorities there in the UAE. This past debate, which was last May, I believe it was, had the privilege of standing and sharing, engaging in conversation with a fellow named Shabir Ali, who is a Muslim apologist out of Toronto, Canada, thinking about this very question of how do we find forgiveness with a holy God. And so God has been very kind over the last 10 years of my life to give me privilege to preach the gospel in parts of the world where Christ is not known, where he's actively opposed, to lovingly reach out to Muslim neighbors and friends to try and help them understand the truth about Christianity and by God's grace come to faith in